This
Uh,
conference
this
will now be recorded.
this topic of dealing with short-term rentals is an interesting topic. A lot of people may be questioning why did the pressure seemingly coalesce around Charlottetown? And while I was dealing with this 3 or 4 years ago, I kept calling my colleagues, Moncton, Fredericton, Halifax, and asking them if they were moving forward with anything. And people at that time were saying, you know, they were aware that there were short-term rentals happening, but not to the extent here in Charlottetown. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open it up and give you some context in regard to what was happening in here in Charlottetown in the last 4 or 5 years, why this issue has become such a very polarizing issue in the community, how we attempted to tackle it, but how we absolutely had to come up with some form of regulation to move forward, how this has been a different type of planning issue than I've encountered before. This is not just a land use issue, it's an economic issue, it's a social issue, and it's a legal issue. And the last one, the legal issue, has been really challenging. For most planners, if you've got a problem, you look to an adjacent community or a community of your size to kind of get a handle on how did they deal with it and see if you can extrapolate and pull that over into your community. Of course, for short-term rentals, there was lawsuits going all across the country. Vancouver had just implemented a new bylaw. Toronto had implemented a new bylaw. The Toronto bylaw had been challenged by the Ontario Municipal Board. So it was under review, and we knew by the nature of this and the amount of money that's involved in short-term rentals, if we come in with a regulation that clearly didn't meet the legal test, we were going to be have problems both with the council, who expect us as professional planners to be able to put something forward that is not only finds the balance in the community with this type of land use, but it can also stand the legal test of time. So Robert, my colleague, Robert Zilke, will, I'll just give you a little bit of a backgrounder, and then when we started to tackle the issue, and he can explain the process that we implemented here. Next slide. Next slide, Robert. Next slide, Robert. So again, just the presentation, again, I'll open it up maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and then Robert will again give you the process. But for those of you that were at the CIP conference last year, I actually grew up here in I grew up in Summerside, PEI, and left basically in the late 70s. I was in Fredericton for a long time, and came back to Charlottetown in 2013, and my recollection of PEI was kind of slow and steady. There was not major, economic upturns. So when I was at the CIP conference, somebody said to me, you must find it a little bit relaxing, Alex. You're over there in Charlottetown. Things are you must be finding it a little bit quieter over there. And again, it was to the contrary that things were quiet here. And just after I had that conversation, I picked up the National Post in Ottawa, and this was one of the headlines in the paper. One of the most severe housing crises in Canada is unfolding in an unexpected place, and that's Charlottetown. And again, there was a whole tsunami of issues that came together at one time that really put pressure on the issue of short-term rentals. So, the province had been really heavily promoting population growth, which was doing very well. There was thousands of people immigrating to the island every year. And as a result of that, there was implications. Next slide. So again, when I came in 2013, we were, the development they had gone through a little bit of a period prior to that, and then the development numbers were down. They were like about 60 million. But then around 2015, 2016, things started creeping up again, and those are the critical years that really sort of overheated the housing market here. So the interesting thing here is we had a vacancy rate of 0.2%, which is almost unheard of. One time we had the lowest vacancy rate in the country. In 2019, it was 1.2%. In 2020, it's projected at 0.6%. And these are some projections that came forward, but again, This is the major issue that's complicating the issue here in Charlottetown. It's the vacancy rate in tandem with a whole lot of other issues that are significantly compounding the issue of why short-term rentals need to be regulated. Next slide. So again, just some data. So CMHC data showed that we had 550 new dwelling units that were completed in 2017 and 2019. The number of dwellings has increased by 3.2% during this period. And our permit data indicated that we had 1,165 new housing starts between 2017 and 2019. The majority of these starts occurred in 2018, 2019. So this issue was building over time. The rental market was the fastest growing segment of the housing market, with 3 and 5 dwelling units that were created over that period headed towards the rental market. Next slide. So, what will happen with you folks, or I anticipate will happen in your community, you're going to, there will be some signs that the issue of STRs is either heating up in the community or it needs to be addressed. And one of the issues are you receiving complaints in your community? Are you hearing either through council or through the residents that things need to be dealt with? One of the issues that was really prevalent here was the term rent eviction. A number of people were being rent evicted, meaning they were given their notice, they were out on the street, and then the property owner would dump significant amounts of money into this property and then either raise the rent, the long-term rent, or transfer it to short-term rentals. So there was a lot of displacement. There was a lot of applications to the Island Regulatory and Appeals Commission, who oversees the rental market as well, indicating that they felt these residents that it was an unfair practice. The other thing that's going to come up, and again, you'll know you've got a problem if sometimes problems appear in one neighborhood or another. These were appearing everywhere in the city. They were in the suburban areas where people we knew were STRing their properties, as well as primarily the downtown. And again, one of the big problems for us initially was, how do you create an inventory? Planners don't have the tools. How do we know where these things are? A neighbor can call you and complain, but if you end up going to court, you can't just sort of, you need to be able to have some mechanism to indicate if you're fully regulating something, you've got a handle on it, and you can't just deal with a complaint by complaint basis. So we were struggling with, how do we where do we find an inventory? And then it's can a planning office find that information on their own as to where these short-term rentals are located? One of the other interesting elements here is PEI is a tourism economy. And what happens is, because of the high quality of tourism here, the province provides licenses. They license your unit, but when they license them, they're primarily trying to ensure that the quality of the unit sort of meets a provincial standard, and that some tourist isn't going to be disappointed. So during this whole period, we realized they were issuing these licenses, but they weren't checking with the municipality to make sure that we were okay with that the land use that was acceptable or was approved in a neighborhood. So we got them to put on their form that in order to have a legally created unit, or if the province was going to sign off on them, they had to check with the local jurisdiction, the municipality, and get confirmation from them that the land use component was okay. And I'm not going to go into great detail, but we did have provisions in the zoning bylaw. There were provisions for tourist home, there were provisions for bed and breakfast. There were some that could comply, but lots couldn't. But the province early on was really not regulating that. If you didn't come back with something from the city, they still gave you a license. So that complicated our issue. And then we had to determine if we had a database, is that the only database? Like who are actually applying to the province for these tourism licenses? Is everybody applying? And we didn't know the answer to that. Next slide. So eventually, we determined that, we had to get into this game. The pressure was building. There was a lot of political pushback on both sides. I will just sort of indicate that I'd gone to council maybe back in 2017 and asked them if they wanted staff to look in at regulating this issue. Again, it was a polarizing issue. It was the end of a previous council's term, and they didn't want anything to do with it. So they balked at that time, but they knew it was building in the community, but they chose at that time not to address it. So by the time we got around to coming forward and attempting to regulate this, we had to find out some key information to bring to council. And one of them, we would suggest that if you're going to attempt to regulate this, you're going to have to do some level of an online survey. You've got to spend some time on that survey. There was lots of criticism in regard to the survey and some of the questions, because it is polarizing. Some people felt that we were leaning to one side of the issue or the other by the nature of the questions, which wasn't our intent, but you have to be careful with that. We got a significant uptake on that online survey. Our first public meeting we had, for those that know Charlottetown, was in Memorial Hall at the Confederation Center. Memorial Hall is likely one of the bigger meeting rooms in Charlottetown. There was over 200 people there. Very emotional. People don't understand the issue and the municipality's legal abilities to regulate land use. All they knew was they were being renovated, pushed out of their properties, and very upset. But on the other side of that issue were the STR owners, who were relatively, affluent people who had bought up a lot of these houses. Some of them had bought up as many as 18 houses. They owned 18 houses that they were STRing, and they banded together as a group to defend themselves against the other side with the renovictions. And then the affordable housing groups were lobbying because the affordability of housing was going through the roof, because the demand on the purchase of these new houses was pushing up the housing values. And on top of that, the population growth that was happening was also pushing up the value of houses. So it was becoming, again, a part of the perfect storm. And again, just to give you an idea how much tourism fuels the PEI market, unfortunately now, because of the pandemic, they're projecting that PEI, the revenue from tourism in 2019 was $505 million. They think that that's going to drop to 70 million. So, but you can just see how $550 million, that's all of those components of it, but housing or accommodation is one of those. And so they feel that this year, if the border remains closed, that the 85% of that revenue will be lost. Next slide. So this is this slide is kind of telling. This is a recent slide, but for me, the light bulb went on in regard to how we could attempt to get a handle on this issue. And for those that, what I'm going to indicate to you speaks well to going to national conferences. I was on the way to the national conference, the APA conference in New York. It was about 2 days out. I was trying to get everything tidied up, and I got this random email from this, didn't know who they were, which you do if you go to those APA conferences. Lots of people are soliciting, want to sell you things. They want to sell you automated building permits, blah, blah, blah. But I got this random email, and I opened it, and I saw a similar sketch. I think at that time there was 400 or under 500 STRs in our community. But when I opened it up and I looked at it, I thought to myself, again, I've been monitoring this issue for 2 or 3 years, and then I saw on this map that somebody was able to plot exactly where these things were in Charlottetown. And I thought to myself, I'm a manager of planning here, and I don't know where these things are. The province doesn't know where they all are. How are these people doing it? So they invited me to a presentation. They made a pitch to me in New York, and I was very impressed with the fact that they had these tools, and they were one of the first people into the marketplace. They're called host compliance, and then subsequently, again, I do have the good fortune to go to APAs, the couple of APAs that had followed that one up. Every subsequent APA conference had presentations by host, and host kept getting bigger and bigger. And places like Santa Monica and big centers in the United States realized that you can't fully regulate short-term rentals unless you've got a partner, and it's some kind of an IT partner. There's host compliance, there's Hamari out of Toronto. I suspect more people will come into the marketplace, but this was the missing piece. And they will find where these locations are. They will find the address of where they're located, and they will give you the information you need to either prosecute or legally go after them. So this was the missing piece of the puzzle. Once we had that, things started to flow because we could go to council, we could indicate what the scale of the issue was in the city. Of course, ward councilors want to know what wards that this is occurring in, and we went from there. So that's my opening in regard to the issues that were going on in here in Charlottetown. Robert came here in 2018, and Robert and I and other planners here, we started to slowly put our case together for regulating STRs. And with that, I'll hand it over to Robert.
Thank you, Alex. Good morning, everyone. My name is Robert Zelke, and I'm planner 2 here at the City of Charlottetown. I work under Alex, and basically working on this short-term rental issue in regards to the Charlottetown context. But before I get into more specifics on how it affected our city, I kind of wanted to take a regional approach because, again, Charlottetown is not the only municipality that's facing this issue. It's a prevalent issue in a lot of Atlantic cities. So, starting off, a lot of this study, we commissioned Professor David Walksmith out of McGill University with the Urban Institute. We worked with Professor Walksmith on compiling data, not just from provincial tourism licenses, but also the host compliance data. And then he also has a program that he runs. He does data scrapings at McGill there, where he scrapes Airbnb, HomeAway, and a variety of other listings, website listings, to compile and locate where these STRs are located. So looking at STR activity in the Atlantic Canadian context, we see that the most active listings we have up there is obviously proportionate to your population. So with Halifax, St. John's, Moncton, Lunenburg surprisingly quite high because it's such a pivotal tourist area, and then of course Charlottetown. So when we were looking at this, it was quite clear that these listings and STR activity is it's commonplace through Atlantic Canada. When looking at the Charlottetown context, we found that we had almost 8% increase over the previous year, and that was almost like an 8 to 10% growth per annum. So that huge fluctuation of STR activity in our market definitely affected our housing market, as well as played a pivotal role in supporting the local economy in regards to tourism. Now, when we take a look at STR activity, we see that it spikes quite a bit. So the lowest point is in February. It starts to grow in May, June. It's at its highest peak in the July and August seasons, which is unsurprising given the warm weather that we experience in Atlantic Canada. It's probably the best months. And then it drops off again in the fall. So this is commonplace for a lot of Atlantic Canadian cities. When we were looking at our STR market, it was very similar in scale on a per capita basis. We noticed that our activity and revenues were as high and in some cases more profitable than other markets in Atlantic Canada. This is a chart that basically takes STR activity and spans it out over the course of a year. Now, a lot of these lines here are indicative of large Atlantic Canadian cities, so those other previous cities I mentioned, like Moncton, Halifax, Lunenburg, St. John's. The line highlighted in blue is the Charlottetown activity that we see. And as you can see, it's very spiky. And through conversations with Professor Walksmith, because he's done studies all across Canada as well as the United States, through discussions with him, he did state the fact that out of any region in North America, Atlantic Canada seems to be or have the most spikiness in terms of activity. So we see the pinnacle of activity occurring or starting in May, peaking in the July and August months, and then dropping off in November. So basically what we see is that it has a high degree of seasonality. And that is very commonplace. Other markets, like the western market of BC, has a pretty temperate climate all year round. So that distribution is a little more linear and distributed evenly throughout the year. So Atlantic Canada, clearly, it's a unique context for STR activity. So now to scaling down some facts for Charlottetown. So when we did the data scrapings, we took host compliance, Professor Walksmith's data. There was high correlation between their data sets. We found that there was, at one point in time, and that was July and August, there was 834 active STR listings. Now, in September 1st, 2019, when we started the study, we found that there were 635 short-term rentals that were active in housing units. Now, approximately, we took those numbers and looked at it from a seasonal perspective. We have about 193 housing units that were removed from Charlottetown's long-term housing market. Now, this is an average, so it can, again, there's a high degree of fluctuation with this. But essentially, you constantly have about 138 housing units during the year, and then in the peak summer months, such as July and August, you see an additional 55 housing units that are taken completely off of the long-term housing market and focused just for short-term rental activity. The majority of the listings, unsurprisingly, has occurred within our historic downtown. So in Charlottetown, we have the 500 lot area. And so the downtown is rife with activity. Again, we're close to the waterfront, a lot of amenities such as shopping and restaurants, as well as parks. And so there's quite a bit of activity in our 500 lot area, quite a bit of housing that was once used for long-term housing was taken off of the market and used for short-term rentals. And this kind of loops back to what Alex was referring to when he was talking about we had property owners that were purchasing up some of these properties that were either derelict, vacant, some were in poor shape, and they basically took it over and they renovated them and used them for basic short-term rental activity. And so when we were looking at how many nights that these residents were used for short-term rental, we see that 75% of host revenue, so occurring between May 1st and September 30th, between that 5-month period, they make the majority of their revenue off of that. And that, again, just goes back and correlates well with the STR activity that we see during those warmer time of the year. And it was calculated that it was one of the highest seasonal variations in the Canadian market. But again, this is very indicative of Atlantic Canada, as I already previously mentioned. So when you're looking at the total amount of hosts that are operating within the city, we have about 409 hosts. They were earning a total of $8.5 million. The average host earning about $19,000, with the top host earning in excess of $430,000. That's the top 1%. As you can see, when we were looking at the way that STR activity was being operated here, it was moving away from what it originally intended purpose was home sharing, where if you owned a property and you could rent out, maybe you had a secondary suite or you had a couple of bedrooms you could rent out to clients. This started to change and become more commercialized, where we had operators actually purchasing up whole buildings, in some instances apartment buildings, and converting each unit into a short-term rental, effectively making it into a hotel. And so we saw that the majority of housing stock that was taken off of the market, especially in the 500 lot area, was that of multi-units. And in some instances, we had some of these larger, older homes were taken as well and converted into multiple apartments that were also then rented out on a short-term basis. And this is where we started to get into issues and impacts with the vacancy rate. So when we were looking at the home shares and the commercial operators, it was very clear that commercial operators were making the most revenues. So as you can see there, $5.1 million, 60% of total revenues were going to commercial operators. And the concentration of these commercial operations were occurring in the 500 lot area, as I previously mentioned. So when we were looking at the housing market and the impact of it, a lot of this is taken from Professor Walksmith's idea on the triple threat. So when you're looking at STR activity and its negative impact on housing, you're looking basically at listings that are full-time. They take up entire homes or units, and one host would have multiple listings. So obviously they can't be their principal residence if they're listing out, in some instances, between 10 and 18 homes or units. They are clearly taking that out of the long-term housing market and operating it as a short-term rental activity, as a commercial authorization. So we have a situation where a lot of these, and the term was called ghost hotels, were occurring in these neighborhoods. And so residents were getting concerned because once they knew their neighbor, that property was either sold, someone would purchase it, could create multiple units in it, and then we're renting it on a short-term basis. They were starting to have issues where there was nuisances where they had people either using these properties as party houses. They had issues with parking. People were either parking on part of their lots, or they were taking up on-street parking. There's problems with garbage and refuse collection being left out. So there was quite a few external negativities that were happening within these neighborhoods. And a lot of these properties and neighborhoods are pretty affluent since they are larger, older historic homes. So we saw that most of the issues were focused on the highly commercialized operations, and the concentration of that occurring in the 500 lot area. So when we were looking at the reports and working with Professor Walksmith, it was estimated that only 54% of listings were being operated out of the principal residence. And it only accounted for 41% of reserved nights per year. So again, we started to look at it on a timeline from all the way back 2018 to 2019 and projecting further, and we start to find that the STR market in Charlottetown, like it is on the macro scale across the country, is becoming more commercialized and less of a home sharing operation. So STR platforms that were used, there was two main platforms, but predominant platform for STR listings was Airbnb. When we were looking at the listings, over 80% were exclusively on Airbnb. That was followed up with approximately 10% on HomeAway or VRBO, and then a further 8% were listed on both platforms. So we had Airbnb, HomeAway, and VRBO. This kind of shows the breakdown of the STR activity within the city's boundaries. So as you can see, when you're looking at the percentage basis, the 500 lot area is highly saturated with this STR activity. We do have some more activity that occurs up by Lewis Point. Again, some of these are larger homes that have been converted into short-term rentals. And it's clear to see that the market drives the activity, and people want to, again, be close to these downtown amenities. They want to experience, the local commercial, so the local businesses, restaurants, important buildings, museums, and so we see this distribution to be pretty uneven. It's highly focused in the 500 lot area, and that is just projected to continue. When we are looking at the impact of STR activity, looking back at the triple threat, something that's home sharing versus commercial operations, we see that all the purple dots are basically the commercial operations, and you can see how they're scattered about, highly concentrated in the 500 lot area, like I've already stated. And then we found when we start moving up to Midtown and some of the more suburban areas, they actually start to become truly home sharing operations. So when we were looking at this problem, we found that clearly the largest impact and the biggest threat, I guess, to our housing market was those triple threat listings, and those are highly concentrated in the 500 lot area, as well as parts, neighborhoods that are just adjacent to it. So prevalence of listing type. So 500 lot area and parts and areas adjacent to it were basically the areas that were receiving the most issues and complaints on. We had affordable housing advocates advocating for the loss of housing, stating that if this continues without regulations, more housing will be lost in this area. Market prices and values were going up, as Alex already alluded to, based on this highly sought after area for short-term rentals. And we were starting to experience entire home listings being taken out of our housing market and being just purely used for short-term rentals. And that was becoming a big issue for us. Clearly, the operators were experiencing huge profits based on that. And a lot of the instances, when we were trying to work with the province, the provincial tourism didn't have all the data, because a lot of these listings were taken down when they were trying to do scanning of their own. Again, it speaks to the importance of having the necessary tools to ensure and see what's actually in your area, what's in your municipality, and then because you have to know what's there before and what's happening before you can actually start to attempt to regulate it and create any sort of reputable regulation that will actually do something positive for the community. So we were experiencing the low vacancy rates. We were getting into that time period, 2018, we're at 0.2%. That increased to 1.2%, but it was still very low. Again, 4 to 5% is a healthy vacancy rate in order to allow for reasonable rents. And so this is something that we were faced and we were challenged by the affordable housing advocates. And when we were looking at our building permit data, we found that the most significant and growing share of housing was rental housing. And rental housing was the type of housing that was taken mostly by the STR market. And of course, that was becoming a big issue on our housing affordability and availability. So we were looking at the availability of housing. We saw that the vacancy rate was clearly being impacted by STR activity. There was a correlation there. The numbers that are presented here are, again, they're projections, not forecasts. So they're based on the assumptions that if the rental vacancy rate were growing with no dedicated STRs, we would be at a much more healthy vacancy rate than without them. And you can kind of see just by looking at the vacancy rate and the projected vacancy rate that STR activities does play a large part of your housing availability, which again affects your affordability. So these are just basically trends that look at the vacancy rate, projected vacancy rate with if we had some regulation, and the vacancy rate with no dedicated STRs. Then we were looking at the STR's impacts on the affordability of housing units. So STRs clearly provides homeowners with a new revenue stream. It definitely increases the market value of those properties, which increases demand, and then thus results in less housing stock. So when Professor Walksmith did a study in the States, he basically looked at what is the potential impact or cost to the community that a short-term rental can have. And so this study, it's based on U.S. numbers and housing. So he basically took that data, extrapolated, and then projected it into how it would affect Charlottetown's market. So we're not necessarily saying behind these numbers 100%, because again, it was based on one study, but it just goes to show that there is a correlation, and it can have a substantial impact depending on how hot the STR activity is in your municipality. So when it came to Charlottetown, we were looking at approximately 37% increases in rent and even home purchasing prices since 2017. So pretty substantial. One of the last slides that I wanted to put up was when we went to council and the community, we wanted to create guiding principles, and these principles basically broadly reflect how to tackle STR activity, or if you're going to start regulating STR activity, then what are the principles you should do it by. And when we met with council, council came up with these 7 guiding principles. The first, obviously, to protect the community interest was to protect long-term housing rental supply. It was our largest growing segment of our building permits. Second was to ensure health and safety. A lot of STR listings don't actually go through a building permit process. Unsurprisingly, people will come in, purchase these older homes, cut them up into apartments, and then rent them out. In some instances, you don't have them apply for a building permit to ensure that there's necessary code upgrades that are in place, like egress windows, fire extinguishers, wire fire systems. And that was a big issue that we identified here. We have a lot of older housing stocks that wasn't built to any code because there was no code of the day to be built to. So when we were getting into this problem, we were digging deeper, and we were finding that a lot of these older properties, which were highly concentrated in the 500 lot area, which were also the most popular for STR activity, a lot of work was done without building permits, and there was no actual upgrades in place to ensure the safety of the occupants. So that was another thing that was identified as a top priority of council, was that if you're going to operate an STR in a building or a unit, you have to ensure that the occupants indeed are safe. And that was one of the main principles they wanted to use when they were getting into or proposing a form of regulation. The third one was encourage neighborhood fit. This goes back to the multiple nuisance complaints that we received from residents. So the idea that residents did not want to see ghost hotels popping up in their neighborhood. They wanted to know their neighbor. They weren't comfortable with random people coming in on a Friday night and then leaving on a Sunday morning and not knowing who those people are. Of course, too, we've seen in the media there's been a lot of instances where Airbnb listings or short-term rental listings in general, there's been quite a bit of safety issues surrounding this activity as well. And in Toronto, we saw those shootings that occurred, and so it's not to scare people into saying that this is a common occurrence. It's not. It happens. It does happen. It's infrequent, but it does happen. But this is something that, again, you're going to find if you do go to your communities, neighborhood opposition will come up, and they will state that. So if you have neighborhood associations, that's one of the main things that they will lobby council to say, that we want our community, we want our street to be safe. The fourth one was promote tax and regulation equity. So we had another segment of the population. It was the segment that actually operated legitimate bed and breakfast and hotel operators. They were stating that they were held to a higher standard. In fact, they were, in regards to either building code upgrades, taxation, and licensing. So that was another thing that we received feedback from the community, that if you're going to operate, it has to be a level playing field. Then there's the support for the tourism industry. Like many other Atlantic cities, those pivotal months between May and September are very important for the local economies, especially because it highly caters to tourism. And of course, short-term rentals does play a large part in supporting the tourism industry. So it's, again, getting back to recognizing it not as a threat to community, but in order to regulate it efficiently and effectively so that it doesn't have negative impacts on the community, but at the same time supports pivotal local industries such as tourism. Then we have the last one, which encourage compliance and then enable supplemental income and property rights. So again, moving forward with regulation, you want to move forward at an incremental pace, where you're not stifling down a lot of regulations all at once. You want to recognize, yes, you have property rights, you can rent your dwelling, but there are standards, there are regulations that you have to be in keeping with. And as long as you get that compliance and you work with the industry rather than against them, it makes things a lot easier moving forward through the process. So I see it's about 11:43. If there's any questions, I think Alex and I would be happy to take those questions. If not, I do have backup slides for regulatory scenarios that we created with Professor Walksmith. But if there's any questions, we can answer them now. Thank you.
It's Alex, just following up after Robert's presentation. The other thing that we encountered, which we didn't anticipate, was the issue of FOIPing, the freedom to information. Because this was such a hot issue, various sides were constantly FOIPing all of the data, how we did the survey, the information from Dr. Walksmith, and it was challenging because they were FOIPing it before this information was getting to council, and it's just tricky. You've got to, your council is who you work for, and you want to make sure that they're well advised in regard to any information you have. So it was interesting during that period. Lots of FOIP requests. We accommodated, and it's not that there's anything wrong with FOIP requests, but it was, that's a new phenomena here at PEI in the last couple of years, and an interesting outcome of this process.
I see a couple questions have come onto the chat line. So I guess starting off with Paul's question, he asked, apart from guiding principles, has Charlottetown Council adopted any regulations on STRs? Good question. We moved forward with a scenario of regulation on how to basically license STRs within our community. Unfortunately, the last meeting we had was March 13th. That was at the planning board that made a recommendation to proceed to public meeting on the proposed set of regulations. And then pretty much the following week is when COVID-19 broke out, and we had to cancel public meetings. So since that time, we haven't proceeded any further with this. We do have a set of regulations. I can quickly go through on the screen here. Council, at least staff, submitted scenario 3. So there's 5 scenarios on regulation that we worked in tandem with Professor Walksmith. We basically brought scenario 3 as a starting point. Now, this wasn't necessarily stating that we were advocating or recommending this to proceed. We wanted to take the most balanced set of regulations to the public and have the operators, the affordable housing advocates, and community residents submit their comments and feedback on that. So scenario 3 was essentially permitting short-term rentals in any principal residence except for apartments, with the allowance for commercial STRs in zones that would permit a hostel or a hotel. And so we basically looked at, what would the impact be on STRs if they start to take, if they were starting to operate within apartments, they become hotels. So if we allow for zones that would permit hotels from a commercial standpoint, it would have less of a land use impact and still protect predominantly those residential neighborhoods from that activity. So that's basically what we were potentially looking at for a starting off point, at least for discussion purposes. And we have another question. How much did host compliance charge for the data you received? I don't know, Alice, if you want to answer that one?
Yeah, it's not inexpensive because it is a proprietary tool. they gave us a bit of a break on it because we signed up for 9 months. But what it is they offer you a number of pieces of the puzzle, basically, if you want to move forward. So one of them is just the data collection. So there's data collection, there's monitoring, they can follow up, they can notify property owners, they can do some they can do some bylaw enforcement for you as well. So there's a number of different packages that you can buy from them. And it's a little bit hard to give a number on it because it's somewhat based upon your population of your city. But let me put it this way, we didn't buy the whole suite of things, but if we move forward, we would be looking for an annual fee of somewhere around $40,000 to $45,000. And I know that that sounds extremely, at least for a little a community like Charlottetown. But what we were going to do was we were going to charge, when we registered every STR, we were going to charge them a fee to cover the host compliance tool, whatever pieces we chose to move forward with, as well as we wanted to do an inspection, a one-time inspection. Buildings that had been inspected are less of a problem, like brand new houses or houses built under the National Building Code. But we knew we were going to get into expensive inspections on these older Victorian homes, which are the ones that are preferred here in Charlottetown, but they're the ones that needed the most building inspection review. So we were going to be charging an annual cost for this because the host compliance fees are an annual cost. And so we did have that worked out, that basically those that were profiting from this were the ones that were going to pay. And even though this annual fee may sound excessive, there's a lot of money being made in this business. So it's like a registration per year would be like one night of accommodation here in Charlottetown.
We have another question in regards to scenario 3, and this is actually a very was a very topical question, especially with council as well as with operators. And basically, it was considering grandfathering existing owners that are already renting or using their properties for short-term rental purposes. And this was quite an interesting and topical discussion because we had some pushback from operators that stated that they obtained licenses from provincial tourism, and thus they thought that they would be grandfathered in under previous rules because they obtained their licenses and not be subject to these new regulations. What we found, though, was that in a lot of instances, provincial tourism wasn't matching up or obtaining confirmation of approval from the municipality. So the province had, certain requirements from a tourism perspective. It looked at, thread count, some accessibility measures for washrooms, but there was no life safety, like looking at ingress, egress, looking at windows in cases of fire alarms, nor did they look at the applicant obtaining approval from the municipality, because we have in our land use zoning bylaw, we did have a provision where you could operate what we refer to as a tourist accommodation from your home, but it was quite clear, and it stated that it would have to be your principal residence, and the owner would have to reside at the residence at the time of stay. So when we were getting a lot of this pushback from commercial operators that stated that they were legal, in fact, when you look back at the zoning regulations, even 10 years before these short-term rental platforms became popular, there was clear regulations and rules surrounding utilizing your residential property as a tourist accommodation. And a lot of instances, they weren't meeting these requirements in the bylaw because they were not staying at the place at the time of renting. It was not their principal residence. There was restriction on bedroom counts. And so basically we went to the operators and we stated that we can't grandfather you in situations where you were never legal in the first place. And yes, COVID, that clearly has, we have another question here that was asking about COVID. So have people been unloading properties or selling properties due to COVID-19? Yes, we've been seeing that. In fact, I was having a conversation with an operator that had multiple properties, and they were, in most situations, they have been now transferred into long-term rental, which is good because it's going to help our vacancy rate. And then in some other instances, we have these properties, yes, being unloaded because a lot of these commercial operators, when times were good, they took out loans, mortgages from the banks to buy up additional properties, and they were highly reliant on the steady income stream that was coming from short-term rentals. Now with COVID-19 hitting, we see that the operators basically canceled all their listings, at the very least for this season. And of course, without that steady income stream, where they were projecting they could make, $12,000 to $2,000 a week, now going to long-term rental where they might be making, that in 1 month. There's been situations where, you're seeing those properties going back into the market as well. So we're seeing bits of both, but from what talking to operators, some of the people in regards to in the affordable housing groups, they're saying that yes, it would appear that a lot of these units are going back into the long-term market, which is, I guess, one of the positive things that's occurred from this whole situation.
And it's Alex here. One of there is a correlation between your vacancy rate and how problematic STRs are. And Dr. Walksmith would indicate if you have a significant vacancy from 5 to 7 or 8%, STRs are not going to create a problem for your housing market, but they can assist you in regard to your economy. So you really have to have this perfect storm that's forcing the regulation to regulate it because of all of these pressures on the housing market place at one time. So these things can self-resolve. Clearly, this whole issue with COVID, there's nothing happening here in PEI. We don't know where this is going to go in the future. How many people will have abandoned this sort of commercialization of these units? They may go to long-term rentals. They may sell them. We're not going to know for some time. But again, if you have like a 5 to 7% vacancy rate, Dr. Walksmith would indicate that you don't necessarily need to go into regulation because it is not significantly impacting your housing market.
We have some more questions in relation to municipalities charging commercial taxes on non-owner occupied STR dwellings. That's a good question. That's part of the proposed licensing framework that we had, working in tandem with economic development. The province does allow us to levy a tourism levy on some of these properties. And in fact, there was, if we move forward with the regulations, we would be taxing them as commercial operations for the period of time in which they operate as a non-principal resident operation. So that was another source of revenue and income that we were looking at to potentially fund host compliance's suite of services to us. So that was certainly another revenue stream, and that was something that we looked at, and we were working with economic development on part of our licensing framework that we were proposing. I have another question here. Using development incentives in these areas. So I guess my question would be development incentives for allowing STR operations, or I guess some more clarity to that question.
Hi, Robert. It's Jennifer. I asked that question. So we talk about development incentives in a lot of different Atlantic provinces as a way to kind of attract investment into an area if there's investment that seems to be problematic. So what I'm wondering is if Charlottetown's doing anything to offset. So if these STRs are considered problematic, are you using development incentives? Are you incentivizing other types of development in any other way that may offset this impact of STRs?
That's a very good question. We haven't taken a look at those types of incentives. I guess the issue that we were finding is we were expecting actually some of the hotel operators to take a more stronger approach against short-term rental listings. They found though that the hotel operators they were 100% booked. They had no vacancy. It was mostly the bed and breakfast and the smaller commercial short-term rental operations such as bed and breakfasts or tourist homes that were basically fighting back on proliferation of STR activity especially in the downtown 500 lot area. I don't know, Alex, do you have anything you can add to development incentives on, from a local perspective?
Well, it's the issue for us is that we had to be careful that dealing with STRs, that the intent wasn't to extinguish them or to make them go away, but was to find the balance between their impact on affordable housing and what they were doing in the marketplace. So I think council was very sensitive about that. And one of the things that came out of the public meetings, and the STR people had clearly made it clear that do not get into some regulation which will result in unintended consequences. And the unintended consequences were extinguishing a market that exists. It has a place. To Robert's point in regard to the spikiness of the housing market or the STR market here, the hoteliers weren't as aggressive on it because they're already rented to maximum capacity. So these people weren't taking away from them. And then what it allows is it allows a lot more economic activity in Charlottetown for those 3 or 4 months without somebody having to build a new hotel and then try to survive for the other 9 months of the year. So that was a part of that equation that is very hard for us as planners to find that sweet spot, but we were endeavoring to do that. And the regulation would be brought in to, again, try to find a balance until it's self-balanced, meaning that the vacancy rate rose to the point where it was no longer an issue.
All right, this is Jay here. Thanks everyone for participating. It's 12 noon. I'll leave this open for a little while more if somebody has some additional comments or thoughts for Alex or Robert if they're still available. But thank you very much for coming. And remember, our next webinar is on June 25th from Alpans. Don't forget to log your CPL credits for this webinar. I've just posted it online, so it should be up on the CIP website very shortly. Thanks everyone for coming, and thank you very much to Alex and Robert for putting on this webinar today. Thanks very much, Alex.
Oh, thanks, Jay, for the opportunity.
Thanks. We had 28 participants, so that's pretty good.
No, well, again, it's always nice to kick one off. Hopefully, the next one can draw some more people, but it's hopefully people got something out of it.
Yes, I think some people did.
Yep. Okay, great. Well, I'm gonna sign off then. We're good.
All right. Good. Thanks,
Thanks,
Al.
Jake. Bye-bye.